This presentation, titled How Regulatory Authorities Use Policy and Standards to Support Food Systems, comes to us from Colin Christmas. Colin joined Eagle in 2019 as a managing director to support Eagle's international growth. He's an experienced professional with more than 20 years in the food industry working for Nestle. Colin had the privilege to live and work in numerous countries around the world, which helped him develop an excellent understanding for process systems and standardization while working for different cultures. He has a bachelor's degree in computing and business analytics from the University of Huddersfield with specialization in quality control, quality management systems, and business process management. He also has program completion certificates from Wageningen University and research for food safety management and from the London Business School for an executive leadership program. And with that, take it away, Colin.
Mike, thank you very much for the intro. So as Mike mentioned, I'm Colin Christmas, Managing Director at Eagle Certification Group. And today we're going to talk about how regulators support food systems. So first of all, I know this is a food safety expo. I just want us to take a step back and just consider the bigger picture of the food system as a whole. So essentially food systems, they encompass the whole entire range of actors interlinked in value-adding activities. So we're looking at production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, disposable of food products. So essentially it's a real end-to-end from agriculture right through to the consumer at the other end of the spectrum. So when we look at food systems, we have to look at the broader economic, societal, natural environments in which they're embedded. So when we look at food systems, I wanted to start off with food security. So right now, obviously, we are in the middle of a pandemic and we see the risk of hunger was almost set to double of acute hunger by the end of 2020. And this is data from the World Food Programme that indicated that over 130 million lives and livelihoods will be at risk. So when we consider that, I just want us to think about global food systems. They're super complex. We have population growth, which is coming, which is a key factor. And obviously this is going to put pressure on things like international trade, which is critical for food security. So let's look at trade. When we look at trade restrictions, what we have seen in recent years, that barriers to trade have increased in recent years. So this is notably raised by the World Trade Organization. Now, in the middle of a crisis such as a pandemic, typically you may see countries adopting a food policy restrictive measure. And ultimately this impacts things like trade restrictions. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO from the United Nations. They announced an advisory for COVID-19 for countries to resist imposing these preemptive export restrictions. This was a really good move, in my opinion. It really helps things like food insecurity that could have happened during this pandemic, which fortunately did not happen. So a benchmark policy, when we look at food security from a regulator's point of view, we saw policy that came out of Latin America. So in the Latin America and Caribbean region, we saw ministers and secretaries of agriculture, basically around livestock, fishing and food and rural development from 26 countries signed a declaration detailing measures to coordinate the supply of safe, sufficient and nutritious food to over 620 million inhabitants in the region. So I regard that as a real key benchmark policy in the Latin and Caribbean region. So that's food security. So another subset within a food system, and an important subset, is food safety and food fraud. So during the pandemic, we have seen a reduction in the number of second-party, third-party audits and regulatory inspections, mainly through travel restrictions and restrictions for people being allowed on site at food manufacturing facilities. So what's the consequences of that? There's been less oversight. So when we consider that, the real consequences are not yet determined. Now, why don't we know what the consequences are? Well, the result is there's often a 12 to 18-month lag when there's food safety requirements that are not met over a period of time. So we have to imagine we've got ingredients in our supply chain. They have been produced, but they are in storage. They've not been consumed yet. In addition, there may be things like problematic trends that may be developing at food processing or food manufacturing facilities without sufficient actions. So trends over time then result in potentially major incidents and recalls. So the reality is food safety and food fraud impacts during the current pandemic are not really going to be measurable until around 2022, maybe even 2023. So how do you mitigate the risk from a food safety perspective? Now we're in 2021. We've seen regulators and organizations considering an increased focus on their supply chains. As I mentioned before, we've got ingredients in our supply chain that were manufactured in a pandemic in 2020. Key ingredients like IQF, individual quick frozen foods. So we're looking at fruits, vegetables, seafood, poultry. So in that case, what do we need to do? In addition, in a pandemic, we see the likelihood of food fraud that is likely to increase due to food insecurity. When there's food insecurity, there's typically financial problems. So there's the opportunity for economic gain. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, if there's less oversight, if there's less auditing and inspections that are happening, there's a reduced threat of getting caught. So with all these disruptions to potential facilities due to the pandemic, the key thing to do is, okay, we look at our supply chains and we have to consider additional audit criteria. We have to look at our supply chain, and that means supplier questionnaires, and we have to consider increased sampling and analytical testing to mitigate that risk that we currently have in 2021. So what's your benchmark policy then with food safety? From a regulator's perspective, we have seen regulators responding by adopting information and communication technology. This is often referred to as ICT. So these are methods for remote food safety auditing, remote food safety inspections that are happening during the pandemic. So some benchmark examples, we have seen the FDA from the US Food and Drug Administration. They moved very quickly in the pandemic, and I think they have to be applauded for their leadership here, to remote importer inspections under their foreign supplier verification program. It didn't just stand still, it continued to operate. In addition, we've seen remote inspections from the Department of Primary Industries in New Zealand. We've seen remote activities happening for the Victoria Department of Health in Australia. And we've seen the New South Wales Food Authority all conducting remote inspections. And I think there's a huge debate about remote inspections, whether they add value, whether they don't. And ultimately, it's key not to stand still. In the middle of a crisis, actions need to be taken, and ultimately oversight needed to continue. So in this case, I regard this as a benchmark policy. Okay, so I've talked about food systems and I've talked about the pandemic. So ultimately, what happens beyond the pandemic? What can really regulators do that's going to benefit food systems as a whole? So in my opinion, we need to see regulators to work more collaboratively and adopt an outcome-focused and a process approach. So we see opportunities here with writing public policy with reference to international voluntary consensus standards, and opportunities to use tools like the Conformity Assessment CASCO Toolbox. So CASCO is the ISO committee that works on issues relating to conformity assessment by improving international trade opportunities and reducing technical barriers to trade. So let's look at food manufacturing, and let's understand what this really is and how regulators can play their part here. Well, I think it's key to start with the definitions. When we look at food manufacturing, we have to understand that food manufacturing is a process industry. And what do I mean by that? Process manufacturing is a production method that creates combining supplies, ingredients, raw materials, and using formulas and recipes. So it's used in industries such as that produce bulk quantities, such as food and beverages, refined oil, gasoline, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and plastics. So when we look at a comparison in the food industry, we're talking about process manufacturing. As I mentioned here, this is ingredients, formulas, and bulk materials. And then we compare that to the other term in manufacturing, which is discrete manufacturing, which is a product approach. So this is often used in automotive, aerospace type industries, where it's all about parts, bills of materials, and individual units. So why is that important? Well, when we look at the process approach in terms of compliance and oversight from a regulatory perspective, if we understand that food manufacturing is defined as a process industry, And if we understand that most global brand manufacturers adopt this process approach for conformity assessment, then we need to make sure that the regulators also understand this process approach and adopt that. And here's a very good example from the USDA. There's a good quote from Steve Olson, who's now a retired USDA inspector. And he said, compliant product has to come from a process to comply. You cannot inspect a product to comply. It has to be produced to comply. So it's good to see here forward-thinking regulators such as the USDA really embracing what really is a key approach to food safety. And now I wanted to talk about definitions. So when we look at definitions as well, is how do standards support regulators in regulating food safety? Well, it's important to start with the definitions. So let's look at that. Some key definitions that's been defined by the US government for their agencies, which I think is probably a good benchmark and a good indication for global definitions as well, is voluntary consensus standards. These are standards that's developed and adopted by voluntary consensus standards bodies, and they're both domestic and international. Then we have industry standards, and these are standards developed by the private sector, but not always in the full consensus process. And typically they require a financial contribution, which is often a standard owner fee. And then finally, we have government standards, and government standards are used by government agencies for their own uses. So now we understand the standard definitions. Now, why is that important? It's very important because from a regulator perspective, we are seeing that regulators are often instructed by their governments, and this is the US example, to adopt voluntary consensus standards before they rely upon industry standards or they develop their own government standards. So essentially here, the key for regulators is to look at the voluntary consensus standards that are already available. And with reference to these standards, this can automatically translate into internationally accepted criteria for their public policy. And let's look at an example of a voluntary consensus standard. We have ISO, which is the non-government organization. They develop voluntary non-consensus international standards. They have 165 national bodies, and they each represent their own country. So essentially, in comparison to industry standards here, individuals or companies cannot become ISO members. The members are national standards bodies, which represent voting rights for the revision, introduction, and update of standards. And in the food sector, the key one is the ISO Technical Committee 34, which represents food products, and ISO Technical Committee Subcommittee 17, which represents the food safety management systems. Okay, now we've looked at the process approach. You also hear a term that's often used in industry is it needs to be outcome focused. So when we look at this, the key thing for international voluntary consensus standards, they are designed to have global range, and they are regarded as outcome focused. So ultimately, they look at the factors that need to be considered and what the results that need to be achieved. And when you understand what the expected outcomes are, it's easier to inspect and it's easier to do audits against that, understanding the outcome focused approach. So this is supported by the World Economic Forum. They explain that an outcome focused regulation as part of a more agile approach to regulation. And in comparison, there are concerns from the FAO in relation to the proliferation of private food standards, which are regarded as more prescriptive than outcome focused. And then let's look at a common vocabulary. As I mentioned before, we're looking at food systems. We're looking at global food systems. We can't have pockets of different organizations and different regulators doing different things, creating their own vocabulary. And here's an example that I just wanted to point out as maybe a thought-provoking. So we saw the FDA, they did some great work with the Food Safety Modernization Act, but there's a challenge here because they defined a preventative controls qualified individual, PCQI. And this was defined in their final rule for preventive controls for human food. Now, in comparison, we have ISO 22000, which is the voluntary consensus standard, and they have just under 40,000 certified sites globally. They define this same thing as a food safety team leader. So here we're seeing differences, different terms meaning the same thing. And when you have different terminology, then a whole series of training was created around PCQI to meet these FDA requirements. And ultimately, was that redundant training and was that a redundant qualification based on the fact that a voluntary consensus standard had already defined a lot of these requirements already? Just a thought to think about. And then what's the regulatory impact? So when you have regulators writing public policy and they don't reference voluntary consensus standards, the challenge is there's often a lack of a common language between the public and private sectors. What happens here is you see teams of lawyers coming into big organizations and they're hired to translate what regulatory requirements mean to their industry. They have to say, okay, this is what the FSMA rules mean, and this is how your current policy and procedures are working, and this is what you need to do to adapt to those. So there's a lot of work here and a lot of work for lawyers to do that translation. So essentially what I'm saying here is without an international reference point, it can result in inefficiencies and unnecessary costs that are a burden to the food industry. So let's look at some benchmark programs. So within food safety, what's happening right now? There's a number of food safety standards that are available and used by organizations. So what we find in the food industry, organizations have a choice. There are a number of industry standards that are available. There's international voluntary consensus standards available. And ultimately that means that for regulators, they have to try and understand what all that means in terms of risk and policy. So one of the benchmark programs that's happening right now is ultimately to help Codex Alimentarius Commission with a joint initiative with the FAO and the WHO. They've created a draft document, which is the draft principles and guidelines for the assessment and the use of third-party voluntary programs. So a VTPA, voluntary third-party assessment programs. So this is a really good initiative. This is going to really help regulators connect with industry. And in addition, we've seen the FDA that will be launching a pilot in 2021 to evaluate third-party food safety standards as well. So now we're seeing regulators really trying to understand what industry are doing and helping them write policy and understanding risk profiles with what organizations have implemented in their organizations. So this is regarded as key benchmark programs under food safety. Okay, so we take a step back. We've looked at food security, we've looked at food safety, we've looked at food fraud, we've looked at how regulators can implement policy and understand inspections with a process and outcome focused approach. But if we take a step back and we look at the food system itself again, we have to understand that the food system doesn't come without consideration to the environment, its ecosystems and biodiversity. So there's some key data here. Half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. That is a huge amount. So what is the environmental impact of food production and food producing? We've seen here greenhouse gases, 26% of greenhouse gases are from the food supply chain. Land use, as I mentioned, 50%. Freshwater use, 70%. We've seen freshwater pollution contributing to 78% from the food systems itself. And biodiversity, so the global mammal biomass used for livestock, 94%. So we understand from a food system perspective, huge environmental impacts, and they're all interdependent. Food security, food safety, food fraud, environmental impacts, all are interconnected. So what's a benchmark policy for environment and food systems? Well, we have ISO standards supporting public policy for environmental and energy management. So for example, environmental impacts are ISO 14001, greenhouse gases, 14,064-65, energy management, ISO 50001. And in addition, ISO has various guidelines around agriculture, including a guideline for land use. As I mentioned, 50% of land use is for agriculture. So it's all about establishing good practices for combating land degradation and desertification. So very key to understand the connection points in the whole food system. And then we look at where the regulators fit in here. So what's a benchmark example? So outside of a food system, we have seen an International Medical Device Regulators Forum. This is where regulators come together. They've created a single audit program called the Medical Device Single Audit Program, MDSAP, and that uses a voluntary consensus standard, which is ISO 13485. So here we see regulators no longer thinking domestically, nationally. We see regulators coming together and collaborating in terms of one audit program and one forum where they can debate the requirements, the regulatory requirements for medical devices. And we have authorities here in the US, USDA, the FDA, we have Australia, Brazil, Canada, Europe, Japan, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, and we will see further regulatory agencies under medical devices joining that forum. So again, I just want to be thought-provoking with this today. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we're looking for regulators to collaborate more. There's some really good work that's going on in terms of domestically. I'll go back to the FDA. They are playing a huge leadership role in terms of food safety, and I applaud them for their efforts. However, their efforts are working on a national basis. So the challenge is would regulators benefit from creating a similar forum, international forum for food safety? So let's look at the conclusion. So we need regulators to think and act in terms of protecting the food system. Today, in food safety, we have regulators thinking and acting in terms of protecting the consumer. However, we need to go beyond that. Regulators need to understand what does the food system mean. So it is protecting the consumer from a food safety perspective. It is protecting the worker in the food system from injury and harm. It is protecting the environment from the impacts of agriculture and food production in the supply chain. So when we look at the food system there as a whole, the key thing here is we have a population of 7.8 billion today. We've got a projection to reach 9.9 billion for 2050. And ultimately, my challenge is the systems that we have in place today that are operating domestically and nationally are not going to cut it. If the projection for 9.9 billion people are going to be on this planet in the next 30 years. So ultimately, we need to strengthen our food systems. So as I mentioned before, the food systems, we need to strengthen food safety, food security, environmental impacts. They're all interconnected. When you understand that, then the key objective here to actually move food around a global food system is barriers to trade. They need to be removed. And ultimately, when we look at that, as I mentioned before, ISO standards, voluntary consensus standards have an important part to play to support this public policy. And more importantly, the ISO standards, the system standards, they're designed to be integrated. And the key point is they have a common vocabulary. And that common vocabulary connects investors, it connects industry, and it connects regulators. So ultimately, we're just looking for common ways of working for both organizations and regulators to have a more robust food system that's going to be prepared for the growth in population that's going to come in the next 30 years. So just to wrap up, I just want to go through some good points of interest for data points. There is something called the Globe Food Security Index. This is a key point that looks at food affordability, availability, quality, and safety with impacts to availability, to natural resources and reliance. A very good website if you don't already know it. Then we look at public sector assurance benefits. I've talked about regulators and food systems. And here there's a good website that was launched in 2020 from the IAF, ISO, and a few other organizations, and they talk about the benefits of accredited conformity assessment. There's a website here, there's a whole section with case studies for how regulators adopt voluntary consensus standards for food safety and agriculture. And then what other data is there? What other publications? Well, there's publications on ISO and food, ISO and agriculture, ISO 22000, and the Casco Toolbox. So all good information if you don't have access to that already. And with that, I just want to thank you for my presentation today. My name is Colin Christmas. If you do have any questions, if you have any thoughts, ideas, challenges, I'm happy to receive any emails from you and happy to continue the debate. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Mike.
Well, thank you, Colin Christmas, for that look at regulatory policies as they support food systems. And that concludes this presentation.